And joining us now is Dr. Robert Lustig. He's a professor of endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco, and president of the Institute for Responsible Nutrition, a nonprofit dedicated to improving the global food chain and eradicating type 2 diabetes in children. Dr. Lustig, how are you? Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Michael.
It's great to have you on. So I was reminded, actually, in looking at your work, which is really very extensive, including several talks on YouTube that have gained a significant amount of views, and people are clearly very interested in what you're talking about. And there was a book several years ago by Daniel Goleman with the title, I believe the title was Vital Lies, Simple Truths. And I kept thinking of that title when I read and watched your work, because I think that that's really what you're doing in these areas of obesity, public health, sugar, nutrition, where we're living under a lot of very destructive mythology, and the kind of results speak for themselves, but we're still enacting and acting out of the same delusions and mythologies. So to get us started, what are the basic fallacies that we're living under when it comes to sugar and calories and obesity?
The food industry and, in fact, the federal government and, to be honest with you, the entire medical establishment continues to espouse three myths. And until we break these three myths, we cannot move forward. And our organization, the Institute for Responsible Nutrition, is devoted specifically to changing the conversation by debunking these three myths. So here they go. Number one, it's about obesity. They want you to believe it's about obesity because if it's about obesity, it's your fault.
Right.
It's behavior. You eat too much, you exercise too little. Problem is, it's not about obesity. It never was. It's about the diseases that travel with obesity. It's about type 2 diabetes, hypertension, lipid problems, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, polycystic ovarian disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and the list goes on. These are the diseases that drive healthcare bankrupt, country by country. Obesity doesn't cost very much money. These diseases are what cost the big bucks. This is 75% of our healthcare budget, which is currently $2.7 trillion. So solving these diseases is first and foremost. The reason I can say it's not about obesity is the following. The government will tell you that 80% of the obese population is metabolically ill, and that's true. But that means that 20% of the obese population is not. They're metabolically healthy. They will live a completely normal life, die at a completely normal age, cost the taxpayer nothing. Conversely, 40% of the normal weight population have the exact same chronic metabolic diseases as do the obese. They get those exact same litany of diseases I just described. They get them at a slightly lower prevalence, but when you do the math, there are actually more of them because there are more non-obese than there are obese. And when you do the math on that, there's more than half of the U.S. population who's at risk. That makes this a public health crisis. And if normal weight people get it, then how can it be about obesity? How can it be about behavior? So that's the first myth. Second myth, a calorie is a calorie. So if you believe that if you eat more calories than you burn, you'll gain weight, and vice versa, if you eat less calories than you burn, you'll lose weight, then you basically are espousing the government and the food industry's mantra. And that way they can say, well, why would you pick on any individual food, or any individual food can be part of a balanced diet.
Right.
That's their way of changing their conversation. Well, the problem is a calorie is not a calorie. In fact, how you metabolize those calories, how you absorb those calories, has everything to do with which diseases you're going to be at risk for. And it turns out that 4 specific foodstuffs are metabolized by the liver to liver fat differently than standard calories, say, from refined carbohydrate, for instance. They are trans fats, branched-chain amino acids, which you get in corn-fed beef, chicken, and fish, alcohol, but kids don't drink alcohol, and finally, fructose, which is the sweet molecule in sugar and is what drives liver fat accumulation, which drives all the other chronic metabolic diseases. Right. So a calorie is not a calorie. And then the third myth that we have to break is it's about personal responsibility. Now, everybody wants this to be about personal responsibility because then they can be pejorative against the obese. The problem is, since normal weight people get it too, that doesn't fly. And the second thing is, in order to exercise the concept of personal responsibility, there are 4 caveats that have to be satisfied. Number one, you have to have knowledge. If you don't have knowledge, you can't exercise personal responsibility. Well, we're being kept from the knowledge to be able to change our diet, specifically by the food industry. Number two, you have to have access. Well, the fact is that lower socioeconomic status people don't have access. They don't even have supermarkets in their neighborhoods. They only get what's available in convenience stores, which is high sugar, low fiber, food deserts, very specifically because of shelf life. Number three, you have to be able to afford your choice. And right now we can't afford our choice because employers have to pay $2,750 extra per employee for obesity-related services, whether the employee is obese or not. And it's breaking the medical and the productivity bank of all of industry. And finally, the fourth one, your choice can't hurt anyone else. Because if it isn't, that's breaking the law. In fact, your choice to eat badly, get heart disease and diabetes, it costs me big bucks. And it costs me issues in terms of productivity. It costs me in terms of social devolution and death. And I have to pay for it. And so I'm not very happy with your choices. And when that happens, we actually regulate. And we've done that with tobacco and alcohol. So the fact is, personal responsibility doesn't work in the face of addiction. Personal responsibility does not work in the face of forced choices, which is what we have today. So these are the three myths that have to be debunked, and my job is to debunk them.
Absolutely, and I think this choice conversation is vital because, I mean, certainly on this show we hear from a lot of libertarians. That's obviously a very extreme version of the kind of choice delusion. But connected with that is the whole conversation that you're raising, that this is about, that this is just an individual choice, as you're saying. Then getting into the details of this, I think that there's a couple of things that we need to disaggregate that kind of come along with that myth. So one is, obviously, if you're talking about obesity in children, they don't have agency to make the same type of choice themselves due to their development, due to their choices, due to other people sort of having control over their health decisions. So that's one and a very important point. And then two, there is, as you say, I mean, you cannot have choice, obviously, in a food desert, first and foremost, but sugar is padded throughout products, almost every product imaginable, including quote-unquote healthy products. So you're immediately getting into a conversation that, in terms of reality, is one of collective action and one of collective challenge. But we, and particularly industries, benefit, and I think personal psychology benefits, and an unresponsive government benefits from the individual burden idea. So I would love if you could just get into more detail of really, really taking that particular myth of individual choice to the cleaners, throwing it out, and then what we have to move on to next.
All right. Bottom line, there's one thing that just blows individual choice out of the water. We have an epidemic of obese newborns. Yeah. They don't diet and exercise. They didn't get to choose what they consumed in utero. 4 studies, South Africa, Israel, Russia, the United States. Birth weight is up 200 grams in every one of those countries over the past 20 years. That's a half a pound. And when you do the DEXA scanning, that is the body composition analysis on these newborns, it turns out that's all fat. So how come newborns are laying down a half pound of fat more today than they were 20 years ago? And the answer is because of what mother ate. So you could say, well, that's the mother's fault. Well, no, it's not, because that's what she was told to eat, and that's what SNAP and WIC gave her to eat. So she didn't have a choice. So we are fomenting this epidemic, and we're basically putting our entire next generation at risk. In fact, we've really, lost a generation of children already to this epidemic. So the concept that they had a choice as to what they consumed is a complete canard. Yeah. And it is that drives me as a pediatrician to try to make the food supply safe for our children today. Unfortunately, every cue, every available thing that's out there is driving these kids to eat. And every limit that we've tried to set has been rolled back, including advertising to children. Mm-hmm. So these are things that have gone on within our society over the past 30 years in the name of free enterprise. The question is, does free enterprise trump public health? And unfortunately, in the United States, the answer is yes. And is that okay? And the answer is no, it's
right.
Not okay.
Absolutely. So then, and let's get then to this kind of nexus, and I think I would like to bring in also your thoughts on, Michelle Obama taking on the kind of Let's Move campaign and these sort of feel-good efforts around, getting healthier, enjoying sports, enjoying exercise. But there's an interesting and kind of disturbing symmetry here, which I think kind of overlaps in what Michelle Obama's campaign has been, because, we, as an example, we cover a lot the kind of assault on food stamps as an example, which I think, is to editorialize for a moment, totally brutal, totally cruel, and just destructive public policy. But you're raising the next layer of that question, which is obviously you need to have food stamps and public funding for nutrition. But if you have a symmetry between industries that are slinging junk to people in food deserts and in lower income areas, and then the government is incentivizing and subsidizing it through misleading food regulations, through not doing anything serious about getting actual nutritional meals and school lunch programs, we're sort of in a very unhealthy dynamic between government and the private sector there. So how did those two things play out of the kind of the aggressiveness of the food industry in moving these products, the kind of acquiescence of government, and then where do campaigns, am I being too cynical about Michelle Obama's campaign? Is, these sort of efforts that come through.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
I think you're being exactly right. It all comes down to that one myth, a calorie is a calorie. Mm-hmm. Now, we have some destitute populations in America. We had, Johnson first and then Nixon's war on poverty. And we needed to get calories to people. And if each calorie were equal to every other calorie, then all of these government programs that have been set up, like SNAP and WIC, National School Lunch Program, they would all make sense if the goal was just to deliver calories. But a calorie is not a calorie. And where those calories come from has to do with what kind of disease you get. So the notion that you can deliver just calories is the problem. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do you fix this? What levers can you press to try to deal with this problem? And the answer is very simple. It's not, I take it back. It's not simple, but at least conceptually it's simple.
Right.
We have this thing called the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill rewards producers for commodities. They subsidize commodities. Commodities are storable food. Now, why did the Farm Bill become the Farm Bill in the first place? And the answer was in 1933 we had this thing called the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl meant there were destitute populations around the country who had no access to food. And the food was being produced elsewhere, and so we needed storable food that could be put in silos, that could be dried, and basically exactly what Pharaoh did, for the 7 years of famine. Yeah. They stored up grain and put it somewhere so that people could eat through the famine. And we did the same thing, and so we subsidized storable food, and that made sense all the way through the Depression and also through World War II. But once World War II ended, did it make sense anymore? The answer was no, it didn't. Yet, we've actually hardened and made those commodities even more precious by changing the rules in terms of how they were produced. And in fact, numerous subsidies have gone to states like Iowa and Kansas, for that matter, in order to create this monolith of monoculture that has occurred.
Is that why sugar's everywhere? Sorry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sugar is another storable food. It's another commodity. It's traded on the open exchange just like it, yes. So this is what the McGovern Commission was dealt with, had to deal with back in 1977 in terms of the change in our diet. And they wanted to tell people to eat less, but the food industry intervened and told them, no, we're going to rewrite your dietary guidelines to eat more, but we're going to tell them to eat more low-fat food. And this is all documented in the new movie that's out today called Fed Up, and I recommend that all of your listeners go see it because it explains how this all came to be over the past 30 years or so. And the bottom line is that because of the changes to the McGovern Commission report that were engineered by the food industry, we now have a bigger debacle than we ever had before because of the substitution of sugar for fat, because it was supposedly fewer calories. Garbage. It causes increased food intake because of its effects on the hormones that regulate satiety, because of its effect on visceral fat deposition and liver fat deposition, and finally, its promotion of continued consumption because of its effects on the reward center, and it's tantamount to addiction. You put those three things together, and you've got a tsunami of metabolic disease that we are dealing with. It's all traceable back to the Farm Bill. And the question is, how are you going to fix it? Well, the answer is fix the Farm Bill. Well, how do you do that? Well, the fact is that all the lobbyists that are involved are going to make sure that that doesn't get fixed. But there is an easy way to do it. It's called differential subsidization. We are subsidizing all the bad stuff right now. We could subsidize the good stuff. We could subsidize broccoli if we wanted to. We've chosen not to. We need to rethink that. In the Nordic countries, what they did when they had an alcohol problem was they subsidized low-alcohol beer and taxed the high-alcohol spirits, and they nudged people toward consumption of less alcohol. And they saw their rates of cirrhosis and the car accidents and their medical expenditures decline over a 20-year period because they provided the carrot and the stick, and the two were yoked together in a coherent policy.
But they lost their freedom.
Do that.
No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I don't know about that.
I needed a little libertarian levity. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't lose their freedom. They just have
not.
to pay a little more if they want to get drunk.
Of course not. Of course. Go ahead.
The point is we could differentially subsidize food in this country if we chose to. And in fact, if we did, the food industry would still make money, and that's their goal. They don't really care what they sell. They've told me so. Mm-hmm. So could they subsidize real food, good food, and the food industry still make money? The answer is yes. But it means a new business model. And that's what our nonprofit is dedicated to, is changing the business model so that the food industry makes its money and we get healthy food instead of food that kills us. Food should confer wellness, not illness. Right now it's the opposite. We got to fix it.
Absolutely. And I mean, as a final question then, so we have to do, it seems to me that there's two tracks of this, because we have a government policy which has its roots in, as you were identifying, some incredibly important, necessary public policies, which namely to fight hunger, provide sustenance and basics for people. That's an absolute necessary function of government. That's been connected to another thing, which I think, again, there is some importance to, which is particularly through the 70s, which is keeping prices down on certain basic foods, which is also, I think, something that is important. And then the food industry sort of providing that environment with these sugar-filled, processed, kind of commodity-based, just junk products, essentially. And we need to move to, the food industry needs to drop that without losing their money, and government needs to continue to deliver real products, real food to people, and allow it to be even more accessible, but de-incentivize and work our way from subsidizing these toxic things we're consuming. Those are the kind of two basic tracks. And that's what we need to address. And it's not about you eating a candy bar with stevia instead of real sugar.
No, that's right. It's about providing what's appropriate. Right. And the food industry has done a really good job of making the food supply in its own image. And the government's basically gone along with it. It's been both complacent and complicit. And the reason is because they're making money off it, too.
Right.
And it's schizophrenic on the part of the government to be in control of what we eat, and then also promoting U.S. agriculture around the world. That's what got us into this mess. Is this schizophrenic, duality of what government's in charge of? Let us be in charge of it, and we'd do a whole lot better.
And let government regulate effectively. And as I love, you had one last line that in one of your talks, you said, government, I would prefer government not be in my kitchen, but I would definitely take them over private corporations because they take my money, my choice, and my health versus some of my money and
Indeed.
my choice. Doctor.
Indeed. I don't want government. I don't want government in my kitchen unless there's a more dangerous force already there.
Right.
And unfortunately, the food industry has insinuated itself into my kitchen, whether I like it or not.
Absolutely. Dr. Robert Lustig, he's a professor of endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's the president of the Institute for Responsible Nutrition, and he's also featured in this new film that he mentioned, Fed Up, which we'll have a link to on the Majority Report website. Very much looking forward to seeing that film. Really, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Take care.